Listeners are advised that this episode contains discussions and descriptions of suicide in prison, as reported by the press at the time, which some may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised.
AIDS brings a response from the government.
AIDS, the disease which claims life.
Welcome to AIDS The Lost Voices with me, William Hampson. In this series, we uncover the hidden history of people living with AIDS behind bars, prisoners who unwittingly became activists calling for reform within prison walls. We turn to the newspaper archives to look back at this neglected chapter of the AIDS crisis and the courageous struggle to change an unjust system. As the AIDS pandemic unfolded, governments worldwide were widely criticised for their slow and inadequate responses, and prison systems across the world, including the United Kingdom, the United States and the Republic of Ireland, were exposed as particularly unprepared. With limited, or rather clouded understanding early on of AIDS transmission routes, public discourse fixated on marginalised groups, homosexual men and people who injected drugs, labelled high risk and subject to intense stigma. Within prisons, that stigma was compounded by the reality of sexual activity between inmates and the sharing of needles, both of which heightened the potential for transmission of AIDS in environments where healthcare, education and harm reduction measures were woefully insufficient. Through my research, I didn't find one country that performed better than another, nor did any appear to learn from the rest. With regard to their prison systems, they all seem to move at the same glacial pace, and in the next two episodes, we'll turn to the Republic of Ireland, focusing on a sequence of events that unfolded at two of Dublin's prisons, Mountjoy and Arbour Hill, where bureaucratic inertia, outdated practices and slow-moving reform efforts attracted significant press attention, illustrating how shared institutional habits, rather than national differences, often dictated the lived reality with an AIDS diagnosis behind prison walls. So, let's get started. It's 1986, in Ireland. On the 16th of January, the Irish Independent newspaper ran the headline, 45 moved to jail AIDS unit, where, they report, a total of 45 male and female prisoners in Dublin's Mountjoy jail were transferred to the new AIDS unit set up in Arbour Hill prison after routine tests yesterday. A Department of Justice spokeswoman confirmed that the prisoners had HTVL-free antibody positivity, which really is just known today as HIV, an early step for some on the way to contracting AIDS. Now, this next bit is not factually correct, but it was their belief at the time. A small percentage of people who have been exposed to the virus can go on to develop the killer disease. However, the vast majority will not, but can pass on the virus through sex or blood transfer, an AIDS expert said last night. The prisoners have been put into a separate wing for, quote, supervision, end quote, the department spokeswoman said. People who carry the HTVL-free antibody positivity virus do not show symptoms. The virus showed up during routine blood tests. It can be contracted through homosexual contact or dirty needles used for intravenous drug injections. And I think maybe they're only saying it's from the gays and used needles because it's within a prison setting. I hope they are. Every country was guilty of just blaming the gays and intravenous drug users. Anyhow, back to the article. The, quote, separation unit, end quote, in Arbour Hill was established after officials of the Department of Justice and the Prison Officers Association visited Brixton Prison in London before Christmas to see how they dealt with a similar problem. No prison staff have contracted the virus. Well, I should hope not. That would mean that prison staff are engaging in homosexual activity with prisoners and engaging in in illegal drug use, sharing needles with prisoners. Anyhow, the AIDS expert said that a prisoner who had contracted the virus would not necessarily go on to contract AIDS. That's not true. Although they were at a higher risk. Quote, there is absolutely no risk of contracting this infection through ordinary social exposure, he added.
When Rock Hudson admitted that he'd got AIDS, it made headlines around the world, and the world watched his frantic and futile efforts to escape death, the hopeless moves from hospital to hospital. While in the hospitals themselves, surgeons working with AIDS victims wore special protective clothing. All this publicity did nothing to calm the fears of those having to mix with possible AIDS carriers, and the two groups most likely to have those are homosexuals and drug addicts. AIDS spreads across sexual bridges and down dirty needles. And with so many drug offenders in Mountjoy, the prison population there is frightened.
If you're outside, it's different. Like you're not so close together. Being in prison, you're confined. Everybody's confined to one space. They're all breathing the one thing, using the one toilet. You have 300 or 400 people using the one toilet at a time. Like, why wouldn't you be scared?
This man is just out of Mountjoy after serving a short sentence. Nearly 40 men with AIDS antibodies have now been moved from the prison to an isolation wing at Arbour Hill. But before the tests on these men proved positive, they'd been mixing with the other inmates. And that leads to fears like this.
So I asked the officer to get me a bowl. So he goes off and gets me a bowl. And it didn't dawn on me where the bowl had come from at the time when he gave it to me. So after opening up, after dinner time, I asked him, where did you get that bowl? He says, he got it out of such a person's cell. I says, that's a lie, I says. He says, no, it's not. I says, I've seen the cell where you got that bowl out of. He says, I said, you got that bowl out of a fella that's after been shifted here with that disease.
Testing for the AIDS antibodies is carried out at UCD's virus laboratory. But if the test is positive, it doesn't mean a death sentence. Only about 5 to 10% of people with AIDS antibodies in their bloodstream go on to get AIDS itself, though it's believed they could still pass the condition on to others. The experts say they'll do that either through sex or an infected needle, that there's little danger of getting it any other way.
The AIDS virus is a very delicate virus, fortunately, and is quickly killed. And temperatures in excess of 56 degrees centigrade will kill it. So ordinary washing and cleaning of blankets will completely destroy AIDS virus. And the cleaning of cups, are subjected to the same temperature when they're being washed.
What if the blankets haven't been washed?
Well, I'd hate to think that they wouldn't wash blood off blankets, but if in the event of them not being washed, which would be a bit unfortunate to say the least of it, I still think there would be a very little chance of getting AIDS from congealed blood, on a blanket.
So a firm statement that Mountjoy prisoners have little to worry about. But according to the girlfriend of one of them, he's in for not paying a fine, they're still worrying.
I was up on Thursday and he just says to me, this place is reeking in here. And of course, I didn't really think of the AIDS. I thought he was talking about something like, just dirt and filth. And he says to me, it's reeking with the AIDS. He says, get up and get me out of here as quick as possible. And I was stuck for a minute. I didn't know what to say to him because I knew we hadn't got the money together. So he says, try by the weekend to get the money together and get me out of here. Now, I was shocked at this because he's never before asked to come out when he was in for fines or anything else. And this time he said, no way. He said, he's going up to his cell and he's locking himself in and he's not coming back out until the fine is paid.
This particular prisoner is in fact a former heroin addict, and his mother claims he's not getting the treatment he needs.
He's getting no medical treatment in Mountjoy. I have a letter now at the moment from the doctor, my own family doctor, for to be brought up to Mountjoy, for to have him brought to Jervis Street for medical treatment because the liver is affected from the constant use of heroin.
Well, the authorities say medical treatment is always available, but 4 deaths in Mountjoy in the last 4 months, and the number of prisoners injuring themselves have put pressure on the Justice Department to make improvements. This is their answer, the new unit in the grounds of Dundrum Mental Hospital, with swimming pool, gym and recreational areas, and 31 individual rooms. It was built for young offenders with psychiatric problems. It's now going to be lived in by prisoners with the AIDS antibodies in their blood and the fear of it in their minds. The Eastern Health Board has parted with its unit reluctantly. But whatever differences there may be over the new use for this new unit, 3 things are certain. The problem won't go away, and hysteria isn't necessary and isn't the answer.
Going through exactly the same phase that they went through in America, where people are afraid to put bodies in coffins and people are afraid to come into even remote social contact with somebody who has AIDS antibody. And I think it's completely overstated.
Then, the following day, the 17th of January 1986, Dublin's Evening Herald ran the front page headline, New Suicide at Prison, with the strapline, Undertakers refuse to handle man's body. Now, this is an incredibly sad story, and it is important to underline that the young man that you are about to hear about, Paul Kenner, was never confirmed to be what they then termed antibody positive, HIV or AIDS, and he had not been housed on the AIDS ward or the AIDS unit, nor was there any suspicion about his status. I only mention this story because the events that unfolded exposed the panic and chaos within the prison service, revealing how institutional fear can override basic decency and due process just by applying the stigma of HIV/AIDS. A 22-year-old man was found hanged in Mountjoy jail today, only hours after another prisoner attempted suicide in an AIDS unit. Undertakers attached to the coroner's court in Dublin refused to handle the body of the dead prisoner, Paul Kenner of Finglas, who was serving a 6-month sentence for robbery. The latest death in the jail, the fourth in 4 months, came after 3 other prisoners in the new AIDS unit at Arbour Hill Prison were rushed to hospital after slashing their forearms with razors. The undertakers took their action after an AIDS scare involving one Dublin fireman with a cut finger, who was involved in the transfer of the 3 prisoners to hospital. He was later discharged from hospital. Senior prison officers had to deal with the body of Mr. Kenner after the undertaking staff said they would not handle any further bodies from Mountjoy while the AIDS scare lasted. But a government spokesman said the dead prisoner was not linked with AIDS, nor had he been involved with drugs. Today, Mr. Joe Costello of the Prisoners' Rights Organisation warned that Mountjoy Jail should be quarantined. Quote, "This is really too big for the Department of Justice. The medical authorities should be called in to examine the conditions of the prisoners to decide what necessary steps are required to ensure that prisoners are properly examined." End quote. Mr. Kenner was found dead around 7 a.m. this morning. It is understood he tore up sheets to hang himself. He had been checked at 6:10 a.m. and was alive then. He was originally sentenced to 6 months for robbery in Tralee. In July, he was sent to Cork Prison on that charge. While in jail in July, he was sent out to the regional hospital in Cork for treatment. From there, he escaped. Then he was recommitted to Mountjoy in January this year on a different theft charge. It is understood he appeared before Dublin District Court only yesterday. None of the 3 prisoners in the new AIDS unit at Arbour Hill were seriously injured, according to the Justice Department. They slashed their forearms with disposable razors. In the past few days, about 30 prisoners who have been found to have AIDS antibodies have been transferred from Mountjoy to a segregation unit at Arbour Hill. But the department spokesman said that the presence of AIDS antibodies simply indicated that the person had been in contact with the AIDS virus. The chance of developing AIDS was very small. Another prisoner was foiled in a suicide attempt at the AIDS unit. Just after 10 p.m, warders found the man attempting to hang himself in his cell at Arbour Hill. A corporation spokesman said one ambulance removed a patient from Arbour Hill last night. Warders who had appropriate protective clothing guided the fireman on how to deal with the patient, who was delivered to the hospital as instructed. The spokesman said one of the firemen had a cut finger, but it was not certain whether this occurred before, during, or after the transfer of the patient. Quote, "Because of the concern, he took the extra precaution of going to hospital for treatment," the spokesman said. I'm not sure what treatment he'd be going for, but hey-ho. The ambulance involved is the cause of concern and has been taken out of commission. It is parked in Tara Street Fire Station, awaiting examination. Oh my goodness, what an incredibly sad story for the men that we've just mentioned, but oh, what a silly ending. This is a classic case of, we did an episode a while back of AIPS, AIPS, AIDS-induced panic syndrome. I mean, what are they going to do with the ambulance? Burn it? Anyhow, at the time, Paul's family, possibly his brother, it's unconfirmed, gave a press conference, and this was captured by Ireland's national television network, RTE, which we can share from their archive.
Next thing we heard was that Paul was found hanged early on Friday morning in his cell. Now, Paul was a drug addict. He was known to be a drug addict to his family. He attended clinics in Jervis Street on an ongoing basis just prior to Christmas. The last time he was in Mountjoy, he received treatment for his drug addiction. This time it appeared that he received no treatment
although a statement has now been issued from the Department of Justice saying that he did receive treatment and actually listing the drugs that he received, until such time as the Minister can give us specific information regarding the treatment that Paul got, I have to hold him responsible.
Then, the very next day, on the 18th of January 1986, the Evening Herald ran the front page headline, "Prisoner is found unconscious," where, they report, a young prisoner was found unconscious in the new AIDS unit at Dublin's Arbour jail today. The man, a Dubliner in his early 20s, was rushed to the Richmond hospital. It follows an attempted suicide at the segregation unit on Thursday night and a suicide in Dublin's Mountjoy jail yesterday. The unconscious man has not yet been identified, but a Justice Department spokesman said his family had been informed and asked to go to the hospital. The spokesman said as yet they have not established how the prisoner became unconscious. He was found unconscious in bed when his cell was opened at 8:25 this morning.
Mrs. Christina Story's son, Ray, is still in hospital after what she says was an overdose of prescribed medication.
Well, my son was 13 months in prison, and he hasn't took a drug in 13 months. And when he was transferred to the other prison, within a few days, he ends up in a hospital. And I wasn't even notified. The welfare officer took us in the car to the Richmond. And when I got into the Richmond, there was all the doctors around my son. And there was no hopes of his life. And I do not know what he got, because he must have got something. As he said, he got something, medication or something like that. But he did not overdose himself, because he was off drugs. Prison is no place for drug addicts. They really need hospital treatment.
The chairman of the prisoners' organisation believes education of prisoners is the answer.
What is needed immediately is an intensive programme of education and information for all prisoners so that they know precisely what the situation is and the lack of danger from casual contact with the AIDS antibodies. And then that secondly, those who have the AIDS antibodies be given a programme of personal and regular counselling so that they don't get into a situation of hysteria with the result that they inflict self-injury or perhaps kill themselves.
In the past few days, about 30 prisoners who have been found to have AIDS antibodies have been transferred from Mountjoy jail to the segregation unit at Arbour. A department spokesman said that the presence of the AIDS antibodies simply indicated that the person had been in contact with the AIDS virus. The chance of developing AIDS was very small, the spokesman maintained. 3 other prisoners at the unit in Arbour were taken to hospital on Thursday night after slashing their forearms with disposable razors. None of them were seriously hurt, the department spokesman said. "Oh, I'm sure you'll agree, it's not even incredibly sad, it's desperately sad, and sadly it doesn't end there, because the following day, on the 19th of January 1986, Dublin's Sunday Independent newspaper run the front page headline, "AIDS scare and suicides spark crisis in prisons," where, they report, a new crisis is looming in the country's jails amid the continuing AIDS scare and suicides. 4 prisoners have died in Mountjoy in recent months. Last night, a 21-year-old man, found unconscious in the new AIDS segregation unit of Arbour, was fighting for his life in hospital, only days after 3 others there slashed their wrists and a prisoner hanged himself in Mountjoy. As the family of Robert Story, serving a 5-year sentence for having drugs with intent to supply others, waited at the Richmond hospital, prison officers and the Department of Justice were in conflict over the prison situation, which will be the subject of a prison officers' executive meeting on Tuesday next. Justice Minister Michael Noonan declined to comment last night, but a Department of Justice spokesman said that every precaution was being taken and full agreement had been reached with the Prison Officers Association. However, prison officers at both Arbour and Mountjoy jails said that the new unit for those prisoners at Arbour was simply the creation of, quote, a leper colony, end quote. Prisoners who did not agree to screening could still have the antibodies, unknown to the officers working with them. At Arbour Hill, where a new prison governor, Mr. Bill Keelt, is due to take over tomorrow, the prison officers claim that they have been given a medical wing without facilities. Quote, "Those with AIDS antibodies have been dumped here," said one officer. Their grievances centre around the possibility of contracting AIDS-related diseases like hepatitis, diseases that they might bring home to their families and friends. Quote, "Prisoners are not forced to comply with the request for screening. They can refuse. There is no ministerial order or legislation to make them have a blood or urine test as operates under the Road Traffic Act." End quote. The prisoners who work in the carpentry area, for example, may receive cuts, and this is one of the areas where disease can be spread. Quote, "The prisoners have been placed here without any prior arrangements being made. We need 19 more staff, but we were threatened with suspension when we refused to let all 33 prisoners in the segregation unit out for recreation together. It was only yesterday that we got full protective clothing," said a prison source last night. "The prisoners were dumped here on Monday and we were promised all protective clothing by Tuesday. On Thursday night, the prison ran out of disposable protective clothing." The prison officers wear full, heavy PVC clothing in any situation where a prisoner has cut himself, but they fear infection when dealing with bandages and other soiled items. Quote, "We were to get an incinerator for the safe disposal of these, but nothing has arrived." End quote. The fear in Mountjoy is that up to 100 prisoners have AIDS antibodies but have refused to allow blood or urine samples to be taken from them. About 180 prisoners agreed to be screened, but the remainder don't want anything to do with Arbour Hill segregation, according to sources in the jail. Quote, "They can't be forced to give a blood or urine sample. It's a technical assault," said a prison officer. But if the political will was there, then that would be changed. At Mountjoy, 10 women with AIDS antibodies are also held in a segregation unit. The prisoners who died in recent months were Christy Gamble, who took a drug overdose, John Scully, also a drug abuser, who hanged himself, Thomas Cowlan from Castlecoma, who slashed his arteries, and Friday's victim, Paul Kenner, who was found hanged in his cell. Then, the following day, on the 20th of January 1986, Dublin's Evening Herald run the headline, "Moves to Ease Jail AIDS Scare," where they report, "New moves to defuse the AIDS scare are expected to be announced by the Department of Justice shortly. As part of the campaign to allay fears about the risks involved, an expert in the area is expected to lecture both prisoners and staff at Arbour Hill Jail on the facts about AIDS and related diseases." Prison officers at the jail, where a new segregation unit has been established to accommodate those with AIDS antibodies, have requested expert medical advice. At the weekend, 2 prisoners were taken unconscious from the unit with suspected drug overdoses. Both were being prescribed medication at the time, and tests were carried out at the Richmond Hospital in an effort to establish the exact cause of their illnesses. Both were being returned to the unit today. Of the 33 prisoners with the HTVL-free antibodies in the unit, 4 others have attempted suicide since they were moved from Mountjoy last Monday. The unit is being viewed as, quote, "a leper colony," end quote, by prisoners and some staff. Many prisoners have refused to be screened for AIDS antibodies and remain at Mountjoy. A recognised medical expert confirmed today that he had been approached by the authorities to visit Arbour Hill. He stressed that there was less than 10% chance of those with AIDS antibodies actually developing AIDS. I thought they said he was an expert. But it's always great when you look back with hindsight. But yeah, this was their belief in 1986. He added that the medical field had a good body of knowledge about AIDS and other related diseases, and the fears of many could be allayed with knowledge. The Prisoners' Rights Organisation today called for the immediate opening of a new medical unit in Dundrum, which the Department of Health has offered to make available to the Department of Justice for the treatment of drug abusers.
One of the 2 prisoners found unconscious in the new segregation unit at Arbour Hill over the weekend is still detained in hospital. They were apparently suffering from an overdose of drugs. They were among 33 prisoners with AIDS antibodies transferred from Mountjoy. Today, the Department of Justice was accused of not making proper preparations for the move and not providing proper facilities.
In England, I know Prison officers who deal with people who have AIDS in prison have had 6 months preparation in nursing training and intensive training. People here were told on Friday night, Monday morning, and the people arrived on Tuesday. And no preparation. The areas weren't prepared, the workshops weren't ready. In fact, if people are going to be segregated, it would be better if the whole prison were cleared out. And then the people who are AIDS carriers would have the full facilities of the prison.
The transfer of the prisoners also means the education unit must be moved again, and the teachers want suitable accommodation.
We have had alternative accommodation since our school was closed for accommodation purposes last April. And now our alternative accommodation is being taken from us to provide services for the people in isolation. So they will have some services in this area, but the building we had as alternative accommodation is a prefab building. It's almost totally built out of beauty board. It's isolated in a cage. It's a potential fire hazard. It's not suitable for hygienic purposes. There's carpet on the floor, a chipboard floor which we fell through twice since we moved in. And it seems like a very unthought out move by the Department of Justice.
And I should point out that all these amazing news audio clips that I'm sharing with you are all courtesy of Ireland's national television network, RTE. And you can find all the links to their website and to these audio clips in the show notes. By the 4th of February 1986, the mother of a prisoner transferred from Mountjoy prison to the AIDS isolation unit at Arbour Hill prison had gone public with her anguish, and the Evening Herald captured her distress under the headline, "The Anguish of a Drug Addict's Mother," where they report, "In parts of Dublin, heroin addiction is just one of the hazards of daily life. It may not be accepted, but it is understood, and news of an addict in a family brings sympathy, understanding, and support. AIDS is a different story. The irrational fear that the disease can be spread by casual contact, coupled with the fact that drug users are a high-risk category, has led to intolerance and isolation. For some families, it's just a cross they have to bear." When Mary Burke found out that her 23-year-old son, Kevin, currently in the Arbour Hill Isolation Prison Unit, had developed antibodies to the HTVL3 virus, which, in a small percentage of cases, develops into full-scale AIDS, it was worse than the discovery of his heroin addiction. Heroin is something she has a tenuous understanding of. She's familiar with drug speak, gear, and packs, costing £40 and the slang names for the crimes Kevin committed to feed his £300 a day habit. People don't talk about you because of drugs, but with that AIDS, well, people don't know anything about it. If someone could just give a verdict, Mary said. The fact that heroin addiction is more socially acceptable than antibodies to an AIDS virus is both a symbol of the extent of Ireland's drug abuse problem and the widespread ignorance about AIDS. It is causing hysteria in the prisons, and that will spill out onto the streets if steps aren't taken to educate an increasingly anxious public. Mary Burke found out that Kevin was shifted to Arbour Hill from a social worker who didn't tell her why. On visiting Kevin, she says, quote, "He was sitting with two prison warders who had rubber gloves on. I said, 'Do they think we have leprosy?' And he said, 'That's what I wanted to tell you, Ma. I have the virus.' It was a terrible shock. If only somebody had prepared me." All she knew about AIDS was that Rock Hudson had died from it. Kevin, who knew marginally more in that he was aware that drug abusers were a high-risk group, volunteered for the screening because he was worried about kissing his 6-year-old daughter Jennifer goodbye after visits. Mary's other son, also a drug abuser, is currently in Mountjoy. She doesn't know if he has been screened and hasn't heard the speculation that there might be mandatory screening of prisoners for the HTVL3 antibodies. Quote, "They can't make you go for a blood test, can they? I think it would take a very brave person to have that test done. It's like someone telling you that you've cancer. Worse than cancer. Kevin sort of accepts things, but my other son isn't like that. He wouldn't accept it." End quote. There are lads in Arbour Hill, Mary says, who have done time before without it affecting them, who are now going crazy because of the AIDS scare. Quote, "It's the gloves and masks. They can't. I suppose it's reminding them all the time." Mary speculates endlessly about AIDS antibodies. Kevin told her that the food in Arbour Hill is better than in Mountjoy, and today she heard on the radio that people with the antibodies should keep themselves in good general health and surmises, quote, maybe that's why they give them better food." End quote. Her 18-year-old daughter wonders why, quote, "If they say it isn't contagious, then why are they isolating them?" That day she picked up a new snippet at school. ARC, AIDS-related complex, can turn into AIDS, and then even a cold could kill Kevin. It eats you away. It's worse than cancer. There was a lad across the road with the antibodies, and people were giving out about him living here. And I suppose now there'll be an outcry from the women whose husbands are in prison and are not drug abusers. And you can't blame them. They have children too, but then if you do something wrong, you can't expect prison to be a luxury hotel. I don't know what the answer is. As we talked, Mary's worries were postponed. There was a call to the house saying that Kevin had been sentenced to a further 4 years that morning, on top of his 2-year sentence. Well, I won't have to worry about Kevin for a while, Mary sighed. In light of recent events, her words were optimistic. Kevin escaped from custody while attending Jervis Street Hospital last week. He is still on the run. Now, I spent a fair few hours trying to find out what happened to Kevin Burke. There was no report of his alleged escape, nor any confirming notice of a recapture, and no record of him being returned to the AIDS unit at Arbour Hill or even at Mountjoy. But I won't give up the search, a nagging gap that won't let the story rest until I find documentation or someone willing to speak on the record. The trail remains open, and I'll keep pushing until it's resolved, and hopefully, by the end of this series, come back to you with some information. Not only were Irish prisons overcrowded, but in the years before the AIDS pandemic, there had already been numerous dossiers and reports at top level highlighting overcrowding, appalling conditions, a lack of meaningful rehabilitation, and the sense that offenders pass through the prison gate as though it were a revolving door. Laid on top of this was a persistent problem of drug use inside its institutions. In that context, groups of men began to test antibody positive, not primarily through homosexual contact, but through the sharing of smuggled needles, given that needles were not freely available whilst incarcerated, and were sadly repeatedly shared between inmates. So, prisoners started to be identified as carrying what was then termed HTVL-free, later renamed HIV. The Evening Herald on the 24th of February 1986 captured public alarm about the state of Dublin's prisons, pointing to an epidemic unfolding behind bars that exposed both the human cost of neglect and the urgent need for public health interventions within the justice system, where, they report, one of the various serious problems facing the new Minister for Justice, Alan Dukes, is what to do about the high proportion of drug addicts in our prisons, a problem which was almost completely ignored by his predecessor, Michael Noonan. The price that society is paying for ignoring the problem is reflected in suicides, AIDS, and the annual £62 million cost of running the prisons. Add to that the money robbed by drug addicts to feed their addiction, the huge increase in insurance rates as a result of drug-related crime, and the escalating costs to the health services and the high price paid for doing nothing becomes apparent. It is not that the Department of Justice did not know or were not told the gravity of the situation, particularly in Dublin prisons, but it would seem that they either do not understand what to do about it or are paralysed by the complexity of dealing with drug addicts in a penal system. The Prison Officers Association, which has incredibly bad relations with the Department of Justice, has been complaining loudly for some years now that illegal drug taking in prisons had reached crisis proportions. But after interviewing a wide range of people from ex-prisoners, prison officers, priests and social workers who are dealing with the problem on the ground, it is clear that these people did not believe that Mr. Noonan had grasped the need for an intensive treatment program for drug addicts in the prisons and a network of halfway houses to help them cope when they come out. Said one social worker, quote, "We keep seeing the same addicts turning up over and over again. Without a really good treatment program, this is going to go on indefinitely at enormous cost to the taxpayer." End quote. When you consider that it costs £450 a week to keep a prisoner in jail, it makes economic sense to spend money on rehabilitating drug addicts through a treatment program in prison, rather than have them return time and time again. Studies have shown that many drug addicts do not turn to crime until after they become addicted. Clearly, if the cycle of addiction was broken, they would stand a good chance of leading normal lives on release. It is to this task of setting up treatment programmes both in the prisons and the new drug unit at Dundrum that Mr. Dukes must address himself if we are ever to see a reduction in crime and the prison population. And with that, it's no surprise that there came a point when AIDS antibody positive inmates patients fractured into open defiance, where, on the 5th of March 1986, the Irish Independent ran the stark headline, Mountjoy, prisoners in rooftop protest, where they report. 3 prisoners escaped from a high-security unit in Mountjoy jail last night to mount a rooftop protest. The 3 climbed onto the roof of the separation unit in the Mountjoy security block at 7 p.m, but made no immediate demands. Gardaí, that's the police to those of us that are outside the Republic of Ireland, Gardaí and prison officers went to the scene, and the prisoners, who were transferred from Arbour Hill prison some weeks ago, were still on the roof 4 hours later. The 3 men are from the separation unit, which houses about 30 high-risk prisoners, 8 of them with AIDS antibodies. Meanwhile, also at Mountjoy last night, 160 prison officers passed a vote of no confidence in the prison governor and decided in favour of industrial action. The ballot is the first of several to be held among the 400 prison officers at Mountjoy. The prison officers are angry at what they say is a proposed change in working conditions. A prison source said the governor plans to rotate officers on, quote, unsocial hours, end quote, duty for 12-month stints, instead of the present arrangement where all officers rotate on night duty and gate manning. Oh, don't you just love a bit of a prison breakout and a rooftop protest? And it caught on, because days later, over at Arbour Hills Prison's AIDS unit on the 11th of March 1986, Ireland's national television channel, RTE, reported in their news broadcast,
"The rooftop disturbance started just after midday when a group of about 16 inmates from the prison isolation unit climbed out onto the roof of the garrison church, which is just outside the main prison exercise yard. They immediately began ripping slates off the church roof. At the same time, another 5 prisoners made an escape over an outer wall. However, 2 were eventually recaptured a short distance from the jail. I understand that these 2 prisoners are still in hospital tonight with serious leg injuries, which they sustained during the attempted escape." During the disturbance, Gardaí and army personnel in riot gear were called in to seal off the area around Arbour Hill. At one stage, I understand that hoses were turned on the protesting prisoners. From the rooftop, some of them explained what was happening.
Treated like lepers.
How many of you are on the roof?
40.
And what's happening inside? What's happening inside the prison at the moment?
The prison officers are trying to get us with golf clubs and sticks and bars.
At around 3 o'clock, it emerged that a number of the prisoners had come down and they were negotiating for the rest of their colleagues to return to their cells.
Well, at the moment, as you're aware, of course, earlier on, some 16 or 20 prisoners left Arbour Hill prison and climbed up to onto the church roof, which is the property of the army. And they made certain demands to the prison staff in relation to visits and in relation to conditions generally. And I understand that these conditions are being negotiated with the visiting committee attached to the prison and the prison staff. And I understand that 4 of them have come down and the rest of them are examining how those 4 are getting on. So, and I understand that the rest of them will be done very short.
What demands are the prisoners making?
I am not aware of their demand, although I heard of 2 or 3. A general improvement in the conditions, I think, and improvement in the visits to their family, and in addition to recreational and work practices, which they want improved.
So nearly 4 hours after it started, the rooftop protest here at Arbour Hill has finally ended. The end came quickly and peacefully, and according to Gardaí, came without any concessions to the protesting prisoners.
That evening, on the front page of Dublin's Evening Herald, alongside a photograph of protesters on the church roof, they ran the headline, "Gardaí hose prison rioters," with the strapline, "Troops ring jail after rooftop protest," where they report. Rooftop riots erupted at top security Arbour Hill prison today. Prisoners hurled slates down at a ring of armed Gardaí and troops in riot gear, in defiance of high-powered water hoses trained on them. But as extra Gardaí and soldiers were rushed to the jail, there were conflicting reports about a possible escape from the prison at the height of the violence. A Department of Justice spokesman said, quote, "At this time, we are not in a position to account for 5 of the prisoners," end quote. The rioting convicts are all from the Special AIDS Isolation Unit at the prison. While the full concentration of the Gardaí was on quelling the outbreak, one Garda source said at last 2 prisoners from the separation unit had in fact escaped, but were recaptured. At least 4 prisoners were injured in falls, it was believed. The 16 prisoners involved took over the roof of the church and used slates as weapons to hurl down at the Gardaí, troops, and prison officers. Several prisoners complained about the lack of educational facilities at the jail, which houses 31 carriers of the deadly AIDS virus. Several prisoners claimed they were being used as drug, quote, guinea pigs, end quote. And one inmate alleged that he had a series of blackouts because of the drugs being used on him. He added, quote, "We are staying up here until we get proper educational facilities. We are being treated like lepers and they are pumping us full of drugs we know nothing about. Until we get these facilities, we will continue up here," end quote. Some of the prisoners said they were being locked up for 16 to 18 hours each day. Quote, "We are being segregated as it is from other prisoners who are sex offenders, but it does not really make that much difference. One of the boys was in a coma for 5 days because of these mystery drugs and had to go to Richmond Hospital," end quote. Late this afternoon, Gardaí and prison staff were still hosing down the roof of the church, which has been the graveyard for many of the leaders of the Easter Rising. Most of these in Arbour Hill Prison are long-term convicts and include murderers. The prison is suited to about 120 prisoners, but of late the numbers have increased. All those involved in the violent rioting are from the new Isolation AIDS Unit for those who have been found to be antibody positive. So, alongside the rooftop protest by inmates of the AIDS Separation Unit at Arbour Hill Prison, 5 were unaccounted for. But the next day, the 12th of March 1986, Dublin's Evening Herald on their front page run the headline, "Hunt for Jail Trio." But it was the Irish Independent that gave greater clarity with the headline, "AIDS Prisoners Free After Riots," where they report 3 escaped prisoners with AIDS antibodies were still at large last night, following their breakout during rioting at Arbour Hill Prison in Dublin yesterday. Gardaí were conducting a citywide search for the fugitives, while prison officers restored order at the jail. And at Mountjoy Prison, a crisis loomed as prison officers threatened strike action over changes in work practices. Trouble erupted at Arbour Hill shortly after midday yesterday when inmates in the Special AIDS Isolation Unit rioted and 16 prisoners climbed onto the roof of the garrison church. The 38 inmates in the separated East Wing had barricaded prison landings and used tables to climb onto the roof of the block. A large group ran along a high wall to the roof of the garrison church, which is outside the prison grounds and on Department of Defence land. 5 prisoners leapt from the wall, 3 escaped after the jump, but the other 2 reportedly suffered leg fractures and were taken back into custody. Gardaí and army personnel in riot gear rushed to the prison. A water cannon was turned on the rooftop protesters, who responded by throwing slates from the church roof. The prisoners shouted demands for improved medical treatment, better work facilities and educational facilities. Oh, go guys. Some claimed they were being, quote, treated like lepers, end quote, and that they were being used as, quote, human guinea pigs, end quote, for drug treatments. Quote, "One of the boys was in a coma for 5 days because of these mystery drugs and had to go to Richmond Hospital," claimed one protester. Shortly after 4 p.m, the group agreed to end their protest and left the rooftop. Last night, Mr. P.J. McAvoy, General Secretary of the Prison Officers Association, the POA, said, quote, "A vacuum," end quote, existed in the prison service regarding counselling on AIDS. Quote, "There is a genuine fear about AIDS within prisons and counselling for those with AIDS antibodies would help," he said. He rejected the allegation that prisoners were being used as guinea pigs for drugs. He praised the Arbour Hill governor and staff for acting well in difficult circumstances. His organisation backed improved facilities throughout the prison service. 6 prisoners needed hospital treatment, said a Justice Department spokesman last night. 2 of the injured were among 6 prisoners who tried to jump to freedom. Another was recaptured, and 3 remained at liberty, said the spokesman. 1 prison officer sustained a cut from a slate thrown by a prisoner. But the Irish Independent didn't name the 3 escapees, but the Evening Herald did, where they reported, quote, "While the Government Information Services spokesman refused to identify the men who broke out, they are George Cummins, 22, and Dermot Fitzpatrick, 23, both from Captain's Road, Crumlin, and Michael Kennedy, 30, from St Mary's Mansions in the city centre area. It is understood that Michael Kennedy was due for a release in a few months' time, while George Cummins had 2 more years to serve. All 3 are believed to be drug addicts and were in the AIDS isolation area of the prison." There'll be more on those 3 men a little later, because also on the 12th of March 1986, the day after the rooftop protest at Arbour Hill Prison, an urgent question was raised in the Irish Parliament by Michael Woods, who at the time was a shadow minister given he was in opposition to the sitting government. His urgent question was put to Alan Dukes, who had taken up the post of Minister for Justice only a month earlier. I located a transcript of the exchange, which, as parliamentary exchanges often do, quickly degenerated into a flurry of verbal sparring, pointed queries from Woods about the government's handling of the protest at Arbour Hill Prison's AIDS unit. Transcripts of such proceedings are usually quite dreary, but this one is notable for the way it exposes differing attitudes towards detainees who had tested positive for what was then termed AIDS antibodies, a phrase that, in retrospect, signals a positive HIV diagnosis prior to the onset of AIDS if left untreated. And for the uneasy mixture of public health concern, legal responsibility and political point scoring, it does seem that both men have genuine concern for the prisoners who tested positive for AIDS antibodies, or for HIV. Anyway, let's get into the urgent question, which reads as follows. Dr. Woods asked the Minister for Justice if, in view of the riot which occurred at Arbour Hill Prison yesterday and the subsequent escape of 3 prisoners, and because of the public anxiety and concern arising from these serious developments, if he will make a statement on the matter. And the Minister of Justice, Mr. Dukes, responds, "The House has previously been informed of the background to the use of part of Arbour Hill Prison to segregate offenders with AIDS antibodies. The decision to segregate offenders in this category was taken principally for 2 reasons. First, to deal with a problem of unease among the general prison population, and second, to enable the restrictions and precautions which medical advice indicates are desirable to be applied easily." During their protests yesterday afternoon, the prisoners complained about a lack of education and work facilities. As regards educational facilities, the situation is that the requirements of offenders in the unit have been under assessment recently by teachers and the prison so as to establish the educational level of the offenders. This was necessary so as to determine the type of classes appropriate to their needs. 2 rooms had been set aside for education for this group of offenders, and classes were due to start this week. The provision of work facilities, however, poses a particular problem because it would be unwise to allow offenders with AIDS antibodies access to equipment and machinery, which could cause cuts and consequent spillages of blood. Attempts have been made to introduce work, some of it of a purely therapeutic kind, which would not involve or would at least reduce to a minimum this danger, but the prisoners did not show sufficient interest in the types of work which were made available. A further attempt is to be made shortly with the introduction of wood polishing, and I hope this would be successful. But again, of course, the prison authorities have, for obvious reasons, to be careful in allowing the use of various substances. It is unfortunately the case that there are several limitations to the type of work which can be introduced in view of the difficulty I have outlined. I should mention also that instruction in physical education is available and used extensively by the prisoners. The House will appreciate that the presence of a substantial group of offenders, all of whom had drug problems and who now have to cope with the knowledge that they have AIDS antibodies, clearly causes difficulties for the prison service, and these are of a kind which did not previously have to be contended with. I am sure the House will acknowledge the difficulties posed for prison staff and management and their efforts on behalf of society to cope with them as effectively as possible. The wing at Arbour Hill was chosen to accommodate these offenders because the prison itself is modern and has good facilities. The regime being operated there was intended to be as humane as possible in the difficult circumstances which applied, and every effort will continue to be made to provide the widest possible range of facilities for offenders there. It will be clear, however, from yesterday's events that the requirements of safety and good order will have to be a special consideration in developments at the wing. And when the Minister has finished his statement, as in all parliaments, debates and urgent questions, the individual that raised it has an opportunity to respond. And this is where often the political sparring goes backwards and forwards. Now, Dr. Woods does give a response. He's asking for more questions in regard to the education facilities. But I just wanted to look at, and you can look at this in full, the link is in the show notes and on the Extra T blog, but I wanted to look at really the question of segregation, because we know it couldn't be caught in, through casual contact. Anyhow, he goes on to say in his response partway down, I note that the Minister is planning to maintain the policy of segregation. He made that very clear. Does he think this is a necessary or wise policy in the circumstances? Does he have available to him medical advice which might help him to sort out this problem, since there is no medical director? I understand that in other prisons there is not segregation, certainly not to the same degree. And Alan Dukes, the Justice Minister, gives a full response, but in his full response, down at the bottom, he goes on to address the segregation question, where he says, finally, Deputy Woods raised the question as to whether segregation is necessary or wise, and if there is medical advice to that effect. Given what is known about AIDS antibody-positive prisoners, and I must emphasise that we are talking about people who are antibody-positive, we are not talking about AIDS sufferers. Our advice includes a strong recommendation that antibody-positive people should be segregated from the rest of the offenders, and we moved them to Arbour Hill. We had better and more modern facilities there to look after these people. This is based on advice. It is not simply a, quote, top-of-the-head, end quote, decision. And with the Justice Minister concluding his response to Dr. Woods there, the Speaker of the House states, a final supplementary question, please. And Dr. Woods puts the following. Would the Minister agree that when prisoners have completed their sentences, they will return into the community and they will certainly not be segregated there? I appreciate that is a completely separate question. Could I ask the Minister to look again, fairly deeply, at the degree of segregation and at the whole medical approach at this stage and see if the decisions taken earlier were, with hindsight, the wisest ones? Would he see if the problem cannot be handled otherwise than with the degree of segregation which was introduced? As the Minister knows, we are all advised that it is only through blood or sexual relationships that the transfers can occur. That would seem to limit such cases. I appreciate the Minister is fresh to this post. There was no trouble in Arbour Hill and it could have been regarded as a model prison. Since there have been long-term prisoners there, it has had a very good record. What has happened to bring about such a radical change? To which it seems the Speaker of the House gives Dr. Woods a telling off by stating, the Deputy should not make a speech. Anyhow, Dr. Woods replies back, would the Minister re-examine that situation? To which the Minister replies, the question of looking again in depth at the decision to provide separate facilities for these prisoners does not arise. The matter is kept under continuous review. It is constantly the subject of medical advice. It's not as if we just turn off our consideration of this problem at 5 o'clock in the evening and do not look at it again for another week. It is constantly kept under review. As to the previous good history of Arbour Hill, that is the case. The difficulty arises because we now have in Arbour Hill, as I said earlier, a group of prisoners who are in a more stressful condition than prisoners generally. That is something that will have to be taken into account both in the medical approach to these prisoners and on the security side. Meanwhile, while Parliament are having this debate, back at Mountjoy prison, a hunger strike is underway, which is reported in the Dublin's Evening Herald the following day on the 13th of March 1986. Where, under the headline, AIDS Fast Continues, they report, a young Dublin woman was still on hunger strike today in protest at conditions in the AIDS unit of Mountjoy jail. Sandra Maguire, in her 20s, is in the AIDS segregation unit of the prison. She started refusing food yesterday morning because she is unhappy with conditions in the unit. Just last week, 3 women slashed their wrists in the same unit to protest at conditions. And on Saturday, 8 women inmates at the unit tried to escape, but the attempt was thwarted by prison staff. The Department of Justice, in a statement today, said, quote, Sandra Maguire is serving a 5-year sentence for possession of heroin with intent to supply. She is refusing food since yesterday, partly because she is unhappy with conditions at the prison. She is taking water. Meanwhile, the search is continuing for the 3 young men who escaped from the AIDS isolation area at Arbour Hill. Oh shit, visiting hours over. Oh, well, to find out more about Sandra Maguire's hunger strike and what happened to those 3 AIDS fugitives, George Cummins, Dermot Fitzpatrick and Michael Kennedy, along with general life behind bars on the AIDS separation units at Arbour Hill and Mountjoy prisons, then you'll have to come by for another visit next week. I'll send you a VO. That's a visiting order for those not in the know. Right, I'll see you on the next visit. If you've been affected by this episode and need someone to talk to, you can contact the Samaritans in the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland by calling 116 123. They are available 24 hours a day to offer confidential, non-judgmental support.